Most people know the story of Elvis Presley. Very few know the story of the man who stood behind him for every single day of it. The man who watched his son become the most famous human being on earth and never once stopped being simply his father. Vernon Presley died on June 26, 1979, in Memphis, Tennessee, 2 years after losing the son he had devoted his entire adult life to protecting. And when the family finally gathered to sort through his belongings, someone mentioned a safe tucked inside a private room that Vernon had always kept to himself. Nobody knew exactly what was in it. Vernon had never said. But when the key was found and the door finally swung open, what the family discovered inside was not what any of them had prepared themselves for. And it rearranged everything. Vernon Presley was not a complicated man in the way people sometimes mean when they say that, not a man of hidden agendas or calculated mystery. He was private, and there is a meaningful difference between the two. A mysterious person invites questions. A private person has simply decided that certain things belong only to them, that some feelings are too deep, too tender, and too irreplaceable to survive exposure to the open air. Vernon had learned that lesson the hard way, across a life that had given him more than its fair share of things worth protecting. He had grown up in poverty in Fulton, Mississippi, the son of parents who had almost nothing. He had married Gladys Love Smith in 1933, and together they had built a life out of almost nothing in Tupelo, Mississippi, in a 2-room house on Old Saltillo Road that they could barely afford to keep. He had gone to prison briefly in 1938 after being convicted of forging a check for $4, a decision born of desperation that cost him 8 months of his son's earliest years and never fully stopped haunting him. He had watched his wife Gladys pour every ounce of her love and her fear and her hope into their surviving son Elvis, the boy who came into the world 35 minutes after his stillborn twin brother Jesse and who spent the rest of his life carrying the weight of being enough for 2 people. And Vernon had watched all of it, steady and quiet, from the position he had always occupied, not at the center of the story, but holding the story together from just outside the frame. When Gladys died on August 14, 1958, at the age of 46, something broke in the Presley family that never fully healed. Elvis was 23 years old and was already the most famous young man in America. He was also a son who had lost the one person in the world who had loved him without condition, without complication, without any interest in what he could provide. Vernon lost her too, and he grieved her in the only way he knew how, quietly, privately, keeping what he felt locked inside the same space where he kept everything that mattered most. The two of them, father and son, moved through the years that followed bound together by that shared, unspoken loss and by a loyalty to each other that neither of them was particularly good at expressing in words. For nearly 2 decades after Gladys died, Vernon managed Elvis's personal affairs, handling the practical business of a life that had become almost unimaginably large. Colonel Tom Parker managed the show business side, the tours, the films, the deals. Vernon managed everything else, the money, the household, the complicated logistics of keeping a man surrounded by dozens of employees and hangers-on from losing sight entirely of who he actually was. He watched Elvis's health deteriorate through the 1970s with a helplessness that he carried in his face in every photograph from those years. He watched his son grow heavier, grow more dependent on the prescription medications that his doctors supplied without hesitation, and he could not stop it. He did not have that kind of power over Elvis and had perhaps never had it. When Elvis was found unresponsive at Graceland on August 16, 1977, and was pronounced dead at Baptist Memorial Hospital in Memphis at the age of 42, Vernon was 61 years old and had just lost the second person around whom his entire existence had been organized. He lived for 2 more years after that. He served as the executor of Elvis's estate, fulfilling the role his sons had appointed him to with the same steady, unglamorous diligence he had applied to everything. He attended to the legal and financial architecture of a legacy worth millions, answered fan correspondence on behalf of the family, and made decisions about Graceland and its future that would shape everything that came after. He gave interviews when it was necessary and said what needed to be said in the careful, measured language of a man who had learned not to waste words. And then on June 26, 1979, he died of heart failure at Baptist Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where his son had died less than 2 years before. He was 63 years old. Grief does something specific to the rooms a person leaves behind. It makes the ordinary objects unbearable. A pen on a desk, a worn pair of shoes, a folded receipt from a gas station that meant nothing to anyone except the person who put it in his pocket. In the days following Vernon's death, his family moved through the rooms of the house with the particular tenderness that comes from knowing that touching something is also a form of goodbye. They sorted through drawers and shelves and cabinets filled with the accumulated small objects of a long and eventful life. And at some point during that process, someone brought up the safe. Not everyone had known it existed. That was the first thing that surprised people when the subject came up. It was located in a private room in a part of the house that Vernon had always kept largely to himself. His own space, his own domain, the one corner of his life where he had exercised complete and unquestioned control. Those who had known about the safe remembered one thing clearly: the way Vernon's expression shifted whenever the subject was raised. He did not become angry or defensive. He simply went still, in that particular way of his that communicated everything without requiring a single word. The subject was not open for discussion. Nobody ever pushed further. He was that kind of man. The kind whose privacy you respected not because he demanded it but because you understood instinctively that he had earned. The search for the key took hours. Desks were opened, old cabinets were searched, drawers full of the small forgotten objects that accumulate across a lifetime were turned out and sorted through carefully. Rubber bands, old correspondence, handwritten notes that meant nothing to anyone else but had clearly meant something to him. The light changed as the afternoon moved forward. And then, finally, the key was found, small, unremarkable, easy to overlook, placed deliberately among his most private possessions in the way you place something you want protected rather than simply stored. When someone held it up, the room went quiet with a held breath kind of silence. They gathered around the safe, this sealed, heavy thing that had sat in that private room through years and decades, through death and grief and the long, slow passage of time. The key turned. The mechanism released with a sound that felt, in that moment, louder than it had any right to be. The door opened, and what met their eyes was not what any of them had expected. There were no financial records, no legal documents, no paperwork relating to the estate. What was inside the safe was personal in a way that caught the room off guard, quietly and completely. The first things that emerged were envelopes. Old ones, their edges soft and worn in the way that paper gets when it has been handled many times over many years, or simply when it has lived long enough in the same place. They had been arranged with care, not stacked carelessly or tossed in together, but ordered and placed with a reverence that said, without any words at all, that these things mattered more than anything else in the room. The letters were personal in ways that no one had anticipated. They were not correspondence of the formal kind. Not the language of business or legal affairs or public obligation. They were private, written in moments of real and unguarded emotion, during the seasons of the Presley family's life when things had been hardest. There were things in those pages that nobody in the room had known. Conversations between people who had trusted each other enough to be honest. Words written during the deepest losses, the most disorienting changes, the long and painful aftermaths of events that had altered everything. One relative read a passage aloud, and the words sat in the air the way certain words do, not dramatic, not performed, but true in a way that lands differently than anything prepared or rehearsed could. He felt things, someone said softly. He just never showed it. And there it was, the quiet man they had known their entire lives, becoming suddenly fuller, more complete, someone they had perhaps only partially understood until that moment. Then came the keepsakes. They were not valuable in any way the world would measure. Nothing flashy, nothing that would mean anything to a stranger who had not shared the history they represented. These were pieces of Elvis's early life, from before the name became a legend and the man became impossible to separate from the myth. Small, ordinary things that reached back to a time when he was simply a boy from Tupelo and Vernon was simply his father. A father who had apparently kept everything. Ticket stubs, photographs from unremarkable afternoons, objects from the years before Graceland and the films and the sold-out concerts, before the world had gotten involved. The family turned these objects over slowly, carefully, the way you handle something you are afraid might disappear if you hold it too tightly. Near the back of the safe, beneath everything else that had already been found, there was a package that was different from all the rest. Where the other items had the soft, worn quality of things revisited over years, this one had the stillness of something that had not been touched in a long time. It sat at the back of the safe as though it had been placed there deliberately, not forgotten, but saved. Set aside for the right moment, or perhaps for a moment Vernon himself understood he would never see. His handwriting was on the front. Not a name, not a label, but words. A message written in the careful, unhurried hand of a man who had thought seriously about what he wanted to say before he said it. Someone lifted it gently, turned it over, looked at the words on the front. For a moment, the room was completely still. Inside was a written statement, several pages in Vernon's own voice. Not the composed and careful version of himself that the world had occasionally glimpsed in interviews and public appearances, but the real one, the version that had existed beneath the surface all along, thinking and feeling things he had never found a way to bring into conversation. He explained the safe. He explained why it had been kept locked and private, why even the people closest to him had been kept away from it. And the explanation was not what anyone expected. It was not about secrecy for its own sake. It was not about distrust. It was about fear, a quiet, persistent fear that had followed him for most of his adult life. The fear that the things which mattered most could simply be lost. That memory was fragile. That people moved on and the world moved on with them, and the things that had been real and precious and irreplaceable had a way of disappearing without anyone noticing until it was too late. He had been afraid of forgetting. And he had been afraid of being forgotten. As the words were read aloud, the feeling in the room changed in a way that is difficult to describe. There were regrets in those pages, named plainly and without self-pity, things he wished he had said during his lifetime, moments he had let pass because he did not know how to fill them with the right words. He was not a man who found expression easy, and he knew it, and it had cost him in small, accumulating ways that he had apparently carried in silence for decades. I kept these things, he had written, because I did not know how to keep them any other way. The family sat with that sentence for a long time. Because in those few words, something shifted. Stories they had told themselves for years about Vernon's distance, about his silence, about the choices he had made that had sometimes confused or hurt the people around him, began to look different in the light of his own explanation. The man they had sometimes misread as closed or difficult to reach revealed himself to be something else entirely. He had loved so much and known so little about how to show it that he had done the only thing that made sense to him. He had locked it away where it would be safe, where the world could not touch it, where it would still be there, intact and whole, long after he was gone. And in the end, that was exactly what it was, proof, held carefully in a locked room for years, that Vernon Presley had been paying attention to every single moment of the remarkable and painful life he had witnessed. He had not left a public legacy in the way his son had. He had not left behind recordings or films or sold-out concerts or a name that the entire world recognized. What he had left was this: a safe full of the evidence that things had mattered, that people had mattered, that a quiet man, standing just outside the frame of one of the most extraordinary stories of the 20th century, had seen all of it and held on to every piece he could reach. He had kept the proof. And now, finally, it belonged to the people he had always kept it for.